At 65, Margaret thought her story was over. Her savings were gone, her marriage had crumbled, and she'd just been laid off from the job she'd held for 20 years. So she did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She packed her old Toyota and drove toward the mountains with no destination in mind. What happened on that winding road changed everything she believed about second chances. Stick around because this story will make you see aging in a completely different light. Margaret Walsh sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by boxes that contained the remnants of what used to be a full life. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen counter next to a termination letter from the accounting firm where she'd worked since her children were small. 23 years of marriage, gone. 2 decades of steady employment, eliminated in a corporate restructuring. The retirement account she'd counted on, depleted by legal fees and her ex-husband's gambling debts that she'd only discovered too late. Her daughter had called that morning, voice filled with worry. "Mum, you can't just disappear. Come stay with us until you figure things out." But Margaret couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden, of sleeping in her grandchildren's playroom while trying to rebuild a life that felt completely foreign at 65. That's when Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She loaded her car with essentials, left a note for her daughter, and started driving north toward the Cascade Mountains. She had memories of camping there as a child with her own parents, before life became complicated by mortgages and marriages and the endless responsibility of caring for everyone but herself. The first night, she stayed at a roadside motel that had seen better decades. The clerk, a woman about her age with silver streaks in her dark hair, handed over the key with unusual warmth. "Traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret replied, surprised by how good that word felt. "Me too, for the first time in 40 years. It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." For 3 days, Margaret drove through small towns she'd never heard of, stopping at diners where locals shared stories about their communities, visiting shops where handmade crafts told stories of survival and creativity. On the 4th day, her 20-year-old Toyota finally gave up on a remote mountain road. Steam poured from under the hood as she coasted to a stop beside a meadow filled with wildflowers. Her cell phone showed no signal. Instead of panic, Margaret felt something unexpected, a strange sense of peace. She got out of the car and walked into the meadow, breathing air so clean it made her dizzy. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about bills or lawyers or where she would sleep next month. That's when she heard the sound of an approaching truck. David Chen was 38, a forest ranger who'd been patrolling the area when he spotted her disabled vehicle. What struck him wasn't just that she needed help. It was the way she was standing in that meadow, arms outstretched to the sun, looking completely alive despite being stranded miles from nowhere. "Engine trouble?" he called out, walking toward her with a confident stride that spoke of someone comfortable in wild places. "Among other things," Margaret laughed, and David was surprised by how genuine her laughter sounded. David towed her car to his small cabin, which served as both his residence and a ranger station. While he worked on her engine, they talked. Margaret found herself telling him about her life, not the sanitized version she usually shared, but the real story of dreams deferred and promises broken. David listened without judgment. He shared his own story, how he'd left a high-pressure job in Seattle after a heart attack at 35, choosing solitude and purpose over profit and prestige. "You know what's funny?" Margaret said, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint. "The mountains orange and gold. I spent 40 years being who everyone else needed me to be. I have no idea who I actually am." "Maybe that's the adventure," David replied. "Finding out." Margaret's car took 3 days to repair, a convenient delay that allowed something unexpected to bloom between them. Not romance exactly, but recognition. 2 people who had been brave enough to step away from lives that no longer fit. David introduced her to other locals who had chosen unconventional paths. Sarah, a 72-year-old artist who had started painting professionally after her husband died. Tom, a 60-year-old former lawyer who now guided hiking tours and had never been happier. "Age is just information," Sarah told Margaret over coffee in her art-filled cabin. It tells you how long you've been alive, not how much life you have left to live. When her car was ready, Margaret faced a decision. Her daughter had been calling frantically. The sensible thing would be to drive home, accept help, settle into the quiet retirement that society expected from a 65-year-old woman starting over. Instead, she asked David about seasonal work opportunities in the area. 6 months later, Margaret was managing the gift shop at the ranger station, leading nature walks for visitors, and discovering muscles she hadn't used in decades. Her small cabin was filled with books she'd always meant to read, and art supplies she'd forgotten she loved. The story isn't about finding love, though Margaret and David's friendship deepened into something beautiful and unexpected. It's about finding yourself when you thought it was too late. Margaret's daughter visited last month and barely recognized her mother, not because she looked different, but because she looked alive in a way she hadn't seen since childhood. "I thought losing everything was the end," Margaret told her. "It turned out to be the beginning." If Margaret's story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let age define their possibilities. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you could start completely over? What dreams are you putting off until someday? Remember, someday is not a day of the week. It's a decision you make right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What would you do if your car broke down in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, no help in sight, and only water bottles that would last a day? Today I'm sharing the incredible story of Elaine, a woman whose life completely changed when she made one spontaneous decision that led her into the vast American desert. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I share stories about life-changing journeys and unexpected encounters that remind us what it means to be human. Today's story is about finding authenticity in a world full of illusions, and how sometimes getting completely lost is the only way to find yourself. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one will make you question everything you think you know about life's detours. So picture this. Elaine had just lost everything. Her husband Richard had passed away. Her financial security turned out to be a complete mirage, and her fulfilling teaching career gone with her retirement. She was driving through the desert in her reliable Honda when she spotted a gas station sign advertising authentic jewelry and pottery. Something about that word, authentic, hit her like a lightning bolt. In a world that had revealed itself to be built on illusions, she was desperate for something real. Now Elaine had always been the cautious type. You know, the person who checks weather reports 3 times before leaving the house and plans every route down to the minute. But suddenly, she found herself taking random exits, following signs that promised nothing more than scenic views. Each decision felt reckless and necessary at the same time, like she was finally learning to trust instincts she'd buried for decades. At night, she'd sit outside cheap motels, watching sunsets over landscapes so massive they made human problems feel appropriately small. Her phone was full of worried messages from friends and desperate voicemails from someone named Michael, but she couldn't bring herself to engage with the life she'd left behind. Then came the moment that changed everything. 20 miles past the last gas station, her faithful Honda, the same car that had carried her and Richard through 12 years of road trips, started protesting. You know that sound when your car is trying to tell you something seriously wrong? Elaine heard it but chose to ignore it. She pressed the accelerator gently, as if kindness could coax the engine into cooperation. For a few miles it seemed to work, but hope, as she would learn, was no match for a snapped timing belt. When the Honda finally gave up with what sounded like a relieved sigh, Elaine found herself stranded on an endless ribbon of asphalt. No traffic, no cell service, no help in sight. The silence was absolute and magnificent. No human noise to interrupt the desert's ancient conversation with itself. Here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Instead of panic, Elaine felt something approaching peace. Standing in the middle of that empty highway, she realized this moment felt like destiny rather than disaster. Just when she was accepting that this might be where her story ended, a pickup truck emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage becoming real. The driver was a man named Kai, about 40 years old, with silver-touched hair and the lean build of someone who worked with his hands. What struck Elaine immediately was something in his eyes, a gravity that spoke of familiarity with loss, the weight of experiences that change the fundamental architecture of a person's soul. After examining her engine, Kai delivered the verdict. Timing belt. She's not going anywhere today. The finality should have been devastating, but Elaine felt an odd sense of relief. The decision about what to do next had been taken out of her hands. Here's where it gets interesting. Kai offered something most people wouldn't. He invited a complete stranger to wait at his place until the garage opened on Monday. No pressure, no hidden agenda, just practical recognition that she needed help, and he could provide it. As they loaded her belongings into his truck, Elaine noticed sculptures in the truck bed, abstract forms carved from local stone, their surfaces polished to reveal hidden grains and unexpected colors. When she asked if he made them, Kai said something that felt like the first completely honest thing anyone had said to her in months. "Stone tells me what it wants to become. I just help it get there." Think about that for a second. No false modesty, no artistic pretension, just a straightforward description of working with materials that have their own resistance and potential. Kai's home was built from local materials that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Adobe walls, solar panels gleaming like dragon scales, and a workshop overflowing with stone in various stages of transformation. But the real magic happened when Elaine met Grandmother Sarah, about 80 years old, silver-haired, moving with the contained energy of someone who had learned to waste neither motion nor words. The first thing Grandmother Sarah said to Elaine, "You look hungry." And she was right, not just physically hungry, but starved in ways that went beyond food, starved from months of existing rather than truly living. That evening's meal was simple but transformative. Fresh fry bread, mutton stew, rich with garden vegetables, corn prepared to bring out its natural sweetness. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from people who understand that words are tools to be used deliberately. When Grandmother Sarah asked where Elaine was traveling to, something in the older woman's direct gaze encouraged complete honesty. "I don't know. I needed to get away from everything, and I kept driving until my car broke down." Grandmother Sarah's response. She nodded as if this made perfect sense and said, "Sometimes we have to get lost before we can be found." After dinner, Grandmother Sarah showed Elaine to a guest room that felt like a sanctuary. Clean white walls, traditional weavings in deep blues and silvers, a window facing west where the sunset painted mountains in copper and gold. "Rest," she said simply. "Tomorrow, we'll see what tomorrow brings." Here's what gets me about this story. Sometimes the universe has to break down our carefully planned routes to show us where we actually need to go. Elaine thought she was running away from her problems, but she was actually running toward the people and place that would help her rediscover who she was meant to be. What about you? Have you ever had a moment where everything falling apart actually led you to exactly where you needed to be? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you like it moved me, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible journeys of human connection and self-discovery. And hit the notification bell because, trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Until next time, remember, sometimes getting lost is the only way to find yourself. Part 3. In the stillness of her small room, Elaine carefully removed her treasured wooden box and set it down on the nightstand beside her bed. This simple act had evolved into a sacred routine, her personal method of transforming unfamiliar places into something resembling home. Richard's wedding ring gleamed in the fading daylight streaming through the window, and remarkably, seeing it didn't instantly flood her eyes with tears as it had so many times before. Something stirred within her that she'd nearly forgotten could exist, a genuine wonder about what tomorrow might bring. Beyond her window, the desert landscape was transitioning into twilight, accompanied by the gentle murmur of community activities around her. She could make out voices bidding each other good night from house to house, the quiet sound of closing doors, and the peaceful bustle of families wrapping up their evening routines. These sounds carried a different quality than the suburban noise she'd grown used to. They seemed more in harmony with nature's own cycles, less dictated by the rigid demands of modern timekeeping. There was something deeply comforting about witnessing human life flowing alongside the land's timeless rhythms, rather than fighting against them. Settling into the narrow bed, she listened to the desert's nighttime symphony. Coyotes calling to each other in the distance, tiny animals rustling through the undergrowth, and wind whispering through ancient rock formations carved by countless years of gentle erosion. For the first time in many months, sleep came to her naturally. No tears, no need for the sleeping medication that had become her only dependable escape from waking thoughts. Instead, she drifted into dreams filled with stones that seemed to choose their own destiny, lulled by the desert's steady breathing. Monday morning brought an unexpected proposition that caught Elaine off guard with its straightforward nature. Over breakfast, Grandmother Sarah casually mentioned while pouring coffee, that clearly came from someone who truly understood the art of roasting beans, that the local school could use assistance with reading instruction. Not in any official capacity. Such roles demanded certifications and background verifications and the sort of institutional obligations she could no longer handle, but as someone willing to volunteer, to sit with children as they practiced their reading skills and maybe share tales that could broaden their perspective of life beyond the reservation's borders. "I taught literature," Elaine heard herself respond, the words sounding both achingly familiar and oddly strange, "before everything changed." "Then you understand stories," Grandmother Sarah replied, placing before her a plate of eggs mixed with garden-fresh peppers. "Stories teach us who we truly are." The profound simplicity of these words struck a chord deep within Elaine's core understanding of literature's importance. Throughout her 35-year career, she'd worked tirelessly to show teenagers that poetry and novels weren't merely academic exercises, but actual roadmaps for navigating life's intricate challenges. Yet she'd never encountered such a direct, confident expression of storytelling's essential role in human existence. "These children speak both English and Navajo," Grandmother Sarah went on. "Sometimes they struggle to build connections between languages, between the tales their elders share and the stories they encounter in outside books." The idea of returning to any form of teaching created conflicting emotions within her. Excitement, because it offered purpose, a chance to be valuable in ways that transcended her personal sorrow, but also fear because her final classroom experience had ended with her weeping over a Neruda poem while 32 students witnessed their instructors' complete emotional collapse. What if her pain remained too raw? What if she broke down again, this time before children who deserved better than witnessing an adult's uncontrolled anguish? Yet something in Grandmother Sarah's demeanor implied that being broken didn't necessarily disqualify someone from serving others. Perhaps the most valuable gift she could offer had less to do with teaching credentials and more to do with simply being present, showing up for children in the committed way that dedicated adults could. The school consisted of several humble buildings linked by covered pathways, designed to foster both community connection and protection in an environment that naturally provided little of either. The structures appeared to emerge organically from the desert landscape, constructed with local stone and wood, finished in earth tones that complemented rather than competed with the surrounding terrain. Solar panels supplied electricity, while rainwater harvesting systems reflected a community that recognized resource scarcity in a place where wastefulness could determine whether they flourished or merely endured. The students, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, observed Elaine with the direct curiosity typically reserved for unfamiliar variables in well-known equations. Their features revealed the ancestral heritage of people who had inhabited this landscape for generations beyond counting, and their eyes held the distinctive wisdom of children who'd mastered navigating between different worlds, the traditional realm of their families, and the contemporary universe of technology and global culture surrounding them. She started simply, reading stories aloud, while small groups settled around her on the carpeted library floor. Her selections blended classic narratives with modern works, though she gradually found herself gravitating toward poetry, verses that captured emotional complexity and language sharp enough to slice through pretense. The children listened with the focused attention of people raised in oral traditions, and she began recognizing that story sharing transcended mere entertainment, serving as cultural preservation that linked them to broader narratives about identity and belonging. During her second week, she decided to read Neruda aloud to the older students, the identical poem that had triggered her previous breakdown. The Spanish phrases felt awkward on her tongue initially, but she pressed forward, providing translations that conveyed not only literal meaning, but also the musical quality, the poet's technique for elevating ordinary experience toward something approaching the sacred. I love you without knowing. How or when or from where, she read, her voice remaining steady despite memories of earlier tears. I love you simply without problems or pride. One boy, approximately 14, listened with an intensity that reminded her of her finest students. From her former life, those who intuitively grasped that literature wasn't about finding correct answers, but about asking more meaningful questions, about discovering language for experiences that seemed too vast or complex for everyday words. He writes like someone drowning, the boy observed when she concluded. Or someone learning to swim, Elaine responded, watching recognition dawn in his expression, understanding that poetry could simultaneously serve as both morning song and celebration, that identical words could hold multiple truths at once. My grandfather says we're swimming in two rivers, another student contributed. Traditional ways and modern ways, sometimes those currents clash. This insight sparked a discussion that consumed their remaining afternoon time as students shared their own struggles with balancing inherited values against contemporary pressures, family teachings against broader world expectations. Elaine discovered herself guiding rather than instructing, posing questions instead of supplying answers, helping them uncover wisdom they already possessed about cultural identity's complexity. After school hours, she frequently walked the pathways, connecting various community buildings, observing how residents moved through daily routines with rhythms that seemed to flow directly from the landscape. Children engaged in games requiring minimal equipment but maximum imagination, their laughter resonating across open areas with sounds suggesting authentic joy rather than simple distraction. Adults pursued various tasks, vehicle maintenance, garden tending, traditional food preparation, with the unhurried competence of people who understood that survival demanded cooperation over competition. She began realizing this wasn't poverty as she'd previously understood it, but rather a different relationship with abundance, one measuring wealth through connections rather than accumulation, through generational knowledge rather than individually acquired possessions. The contrast with her former existence was dramatic and initially bewildering, yet strangely freeing. Here, worth was determined by community contributions rather than personal purchasing power. Kai labored during late afternoons when slanted light streamed through his workshop windows, illuminating dust particles that danced around his projects like tiny spirits, celebrating raw materials transformation into art. The workshop itself embodied the marriage of ancestral wisdom and modern technique, hand tools that appeared inherited, across generations sharing space with contemporary power equipment, ancient methods adapted for current materials. Elaine began timing her walks to coincide with these work sessions, drawn by the rhythmic sound of chisel meeting stone and the sight of forms emerging from rough material through patient application of skill and vision. Something mesmerizing existed in watching him work, the way his hands seemed to listen to stone before deciding where to apply pressure, how he could examine a crude block and perceive the completed sculpture already present within, awaiting revelation. He worked without obvious planning, allowing his hands to follow instincts that appeared to bypass conscious thinking. She observed him rotating a sandstone piece in his palms, sensing for some unnamed quality, perhaps grain direction or internal stress patterns that would determine the material's carving response. Only after satisfying himself with understanding the stone's unique characteristics would he begin the delicate work of revelation. "What exactly are you searching for?" she asked one evening, settling onto a wooden stool that seemed positioned there specifically for observers. "The part that wants to be liberated," he replied without lifting his gaze from his work. She began understanding that his sculptures weren't impositions of will upon matter, but rather collaborations between vision and material limitations. Each piece discovered its final form through negotiation. The artist's intention shaped by stone's resistance, the end result reflecting both human creativity and natural law. She realized this perfectly metaphorized healing's process, not through forcing change, but through patient attention to what already existed and awaited emergence. "I used to teach students to approach poetry similarly," she said, watching him. "Use a fine-pointed chisel to reveal detail in what was becoming an abstract bird's wing, searching for what wanted to emerge from words rather than imposing external meaning. Teaching sounds similar to sculpting. I think perhaps it was. Their conversations developed gradually, emerging from shared workshop silences, like shapes emerging from stone. He spoke sparingly about military service, but she began assembling fragments, overseas deployment, responsibilities requiring life and death decisions, a homecoming that had changed him in ways civilian language couldn't adequately capture. She found herself revealing more than intended about Richard, about her sense of purpose slowly dissolving after retirement, about the peculiar grief accompanying her discovery that her trusted brother had systematically betrayed her over years, but also about the unexpected relief of leaving that life behind, the strange freedom that came with having nothing remaining. To lose. "Betrayal rewrites the past," she said one evening, while watching him work turquoise-veined stone that seemed to glow with inner light. "It forces you to question everything you believed about people you loved." "War does that too," he replied, using sandpaper to smooth a curve that would eventually become part of the sculpture's central flow. "Makes you wonder whether your former self still exists or was just an illusion you maintained until reality." Forced clear sight. These conversations felt unlike any from her previous life, more honest perhaps because they occurred between people who'd both lost the luxury of pretending the world was predictable or safe. No need existed to maintain social facades or shield each other from uncomfortable truths. Both had already faced life's worst offerings, and having survived, they could speak with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to hide. "Sometimes I think grief is simply love with nowhere to go," she said one evening, watching sunset transform his workshop into a cathedral of golden light and dancing shadows. "Then perhaps healing means learning to find new places for it to live." This observation's simplicity struck her with unexpected power. For months, she'd carried her love for Richard like a burden, something heavy and painful she couldn't set down, but couldn't bear to keep carrying. But perhaps other ways existed to think about it, not as something requiring cure or conquest, but as something to be redirected toward new purposes, new connection forms that honored what was lost while making space for what might yet be discovered. "What led you to sculpting?" "Necessity," he said, and she could hear multiple meanings layered in that single word. "After returning from deployment, I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't make sense of anything that had happened. My hands needed occupation, something demanding enough attention to quiet the mental noise. The stone helped. Stone demands honesty. It won't accept anything false or forced. If I tried imposing my will without listening to its needs, it would break or crack in ways that ruined everything. I had to learn collaboration instead of domination." She watched his hands while he spoke, noting their unconscious grace across stone surfaces, reading textures and temperatures that provided information. Invisible to untrained eyes, these were hands that had learned to listen, to receive touch-based information, and translate it into purposeful action. "It sounds like meditation." "It is meditation, the kind that leaves you with something beautiful when finished." The nightmares started during her third week, arriving without warning like summer storms appearing suddenly on clear horizons. They came during deep night hours when consciousness was most defenseless, jerking her from sleep with desperate gasping that suggested drowning in dreams rather than water. These weren't nightmares about Richard's accident. She'd learned navigating those particular waters, breathing through the terror of reliving that phone call, that hospital drive, that moment when she understood her life had been permanently split into before and after. These were different dreams, more abstract yet somehow more menacing. Dreams of houses burning while she stood paralyzed outside, unable to reach something precious just beyond her grasp. Dreams of being lost in vast spaces where her voice carried no sound, where calling for help produced only silence. Dreams of children crying in incomprehensible languages, their faces blurred, but their distress unmistakably real. She found herself wandering the small house during pre-dawn darkness, trying to walk off residual terror that clung to her like smoke from fires existing only in her unconscious mind. The house felt different at night, more alive somehow, filled with small sounds of structure settling into itself, adjusting to temperature changes, breathing with the slow rhythm of adobe walls that had absorbed decades of heat and cold, joy and sorrow, the accumulated weight of human experience. During one of these nocturnal wanderings, she encountered Kai sitting on the front porch, fully dressed despite the hour, as if he too had learned that sleep wasn't always reliable refuge from consciousness. He looked up as she emerged from the house, his expression suggesting her presence was neither unexpected nor unwelcome. "Bad dreams?" he asked without surprise. "The usual variety," she replied, settling into the wooden chair beside him that seemed placed there for exactly this purpose. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the eastern horizon for dawn's first hint. The desert night was alive with sounds she was learning to identify, distant coyotes conducting their ancient conversations across miles of open space, small creatures rustling through brush in patterns determined by hunger and predator avoidance, wind whispering through rock formations shaped by millions of years of patient erosion. Above them, stars brilliant in clear desert air told stories of distances so vast that human troubles seemed appropriately small in context. She'd read about urban light pollution, but had never truly understood how much universe remained invisible to city dwellers until experiencing the full cathedral of night sky that revealed itself where artificial light didn't compete with cosmic illumination. "Some nights I dream I'm still deployed," he said eventually, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting memorized facts not yet learned to accept. "Still responsible for keeping people alive. I wake up feeling like I've failed at something. Essential, like there's some task I'm supposed to be performing but can't remember. What happened over there?" The question hung between them, heavier than she'd intended. She watched his profile in starlight, noting how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, how his hands stilled on chair arms as if preparing for physical impact. "My brother was in my unit, Danny. He was 2 years younger but had always been the tough one, the one who charged ahead while I tried thinking things through." His voice carried the particular weight that comes with speaking carefully preserved, truths rarely shared. "We were supposed to watch out for each other. That was our deal with our parents before leaving, that we'd come home together or not at all. He died, and I made the call that got him killed." The statement emerged without emotion, as if he'd practiced delivering it in the most neutral tone possible. "We were clearing a building that intelligence said was empty. I was squad leader, so the decision about how to proceed was mine. I chose the approach that seemed safest for most of the unit, but it put Danny in position where he took the blast meant for the rest of us." This revelation's weight settled between them like a third presence, invisible, but undeniably real. Elaine found herself thinking about guilt's different forms, how it could transform survival into crime, love into a weapon turned against the lover. "Sometimes survival feels like theft," she said, surprised by the statement's truth. "Exactly like theft, like I stole years that belonged to him, experiences that were his by right. I came home and he didn't. There's no logic to it, no justice." Part 4, Finding Home, a story of unexpected belonging. Picture this: a woman who thought she had lost everything, only to discover she had been searching for the wrong kind of wealth her entire life. This is Elaine's story, and it might just change how you think about what it means to be truly rich. The artist's gift, Elaine, noticed something magical happening around her. There was this local artist, let's call him the creative mentor, whose presence seemed to radiate an almost supernatural energy when he worked. Kids would flock to him like he was some kind of magnet, drawn to his gentle way of teaching. One day, a young student showed Elaine a drawing that would shake her understanding of everything. "What's this bird here?" Elaine asked, gesturing toward the winged creature that took up most of the top section. The child's response was matter of fact, the way kids explain things they think adults should obviously understand. That's the story bird. It flies stories from the old times to the new times, from people who aren't here anymore to people who still are. Can you imagine? This 7-year-old had captured something in pictures that Elaine had been trying to express in words for years. The idea that stories act as bridges, connecting yesterday with today, tradition with change, those we've lost with those still living. Hidden truths in children's art. That same evening, Elaine brought the artwork to Kai, her friend who worked with stones and understood that children often express truths that take adults decades to figure out. He examined it, like he studied his rocks, carefully, thoroughly, holding it up to catch the light from his workshop. "Look here," Kai pointed out. "She's drawn roots coming from your feet." Elaine looked closer and realized he was absolutely right. What she'd mistaken for simple decorative lines were actually root systems connecting her figure to the earth below. Not just standing on the ground, but truly planted there. Not just visiting a place, but actually living in it. "Kids notice things we've forgotten how to see," Kai observed. "They haven't learned yet that some things are supposed to be impossible." "What do you think she sees in me?" Elaine wondered. "Someone who's discovered where they fit. Someone who quit running away and started putting down roots." This conversation lingered with Elaine long after their talk ended, but for the first time in ages, her sleeplessness wasn't driven by worry. It was excitement, like her whole body was getting used to the idea that this feeling of rightness wasn't just temporary. Since Richard's passing, she hadn't dared make long-term plans. Now she found herself imagining the future, books she could share with students, traditional tales she might learn from community elders, ways to connect ancient wisdom with modern education needs. The next morning delivered a reality check, a forwarded letter from her brother Michael. His usually neat handwriting looked frantic, almost illegible with desperation. Inside were legal papers and a scattered explanation about attorneys, recovery processes, and the chance to get back some of the money he'd lost through his financial schemes. But as Elaine read his urgent words, her mind wandered to different types of wealth. She thought about having resources versus being genuinely rich, about financial safety versus real security. The child's drawing sat on her nightstand, along with memories of students sharing their stories, of hands learning to understand stone, of hearts finding unexpected healing. She folded Michael's letter and tucked it away with other remnants from her previous existence. Souvenirs from when she measured success differently, when she believed security could be bought and belonging could be taken for granted. Sitting in a home built from desert materials by people who knew that survival meant community over accumulation, a profound realization hit her. She had always been wealthy, just too scared to recognize it. This understanding brought a sense of wholeness she'd never felt in 37 years of marriage, 35 years of teaching, or 62 years of trying to construct a life that would shield her from uncertainty. Here, where uncertainty was just another weather pattern to prepare for and endure, she had finally learned what being rich actually meant. October arrived with winter's promise and an unexpected test of how deeply committed Elaine was to this new life she was building. Michael's letter had triggered a series of phone calls to Grandmother Sarah's house, increasingly frantic attempts to contact her that ended with registered mail containing legal documents requiring her signature to participate in money recovery efforts. The paperwork covered the kitchen table like artifacts from someone else's existence. Bank statements, investment records, forensic accounting reports documenting the systematic theft of her financial future. Michael's lawyers claimed there was a solid chance of recovering maybe 60% of what was stolen, enough to rebuild something, close to the retirement security she'd originally planned. "That's significant money," she told Grandmother Sarah, who had reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that financial complexity often hid simple greed. "It certainly is," the older woman replied. "The real question is what you'd do with it if you got it back." This was exactly what had been keeping Elaine awake, because honestly, she no longer understood what financial security was supposed to accomplish. The life she'd been saving for, comfortable retirement, travel, maybe an oceanside house, felt like it belonged to a stranger who believed happiness could be purchased and meaning could accumulate like compound interest. I thought I had it figured out, she confessed, but I really don't anymore. And if you stayed here instead, keep working at the school. Maybe create a real reading program that helps students prepare for college while staying connected to traditional stories. Learn weaving and traditional crafts. Support Kai in his teaching. The words flowed without planning, revealing dreams she hadn't realized she was nurturing. Those sound like the plans of someone expecting to stick around. They really do, don't they? Talking with Kai proved more challenging, partly because it meant acknowledging feelings she'd been trying to suppress, emotions that complicated the story of mutual healing and artistic partnership that had developed between them. They were hiking the trail behind his workshop, following the path to red rock formations that glowed like beacons in the fading afternoon light, when she finally forced herself to be direct. "My brother wants me to return," she said, the words feeling strange and heavy. "There might be legal ways to recover some of the money he lost." Kai walked several steps in silence, quiet long enough that she wondered if he was calculating what her potential departure would mean for his own life, his own carefully balanced world. "Do you want that money back?" "I want it back. Does that sound crazy?" "Makes perfect sense, but I keep thinking about that drawing, about truly belonging somewhere. I've never experienced that before, not even during my marriage. Richard and I loved each other, but we never really belonged anywhere together." Recognizing that this type of revelation would alter their relationship forever, potentially creating either profound connection or an impossible chasm, he spoke with the measured cadence of someone stating rehearsed truths they hadn't yet fully embraced. "I had decided to end my life," he went on, his words carrying that hollow quality people use when recounting memorized facts. Every detail was planned, the method, the location, the timing. "My intention was to head into the wilderness and simply vanish, becoming another disappeared soul, presumably deceased but never officially confirmed." "What changed your mind?" she asked. "My grandmother, Sarah. She arrived at my doorstep one morning carrying fresh fry bread, telling me I resembled someone who'd lost the ability to nourish themselves. She didn't attempt to dissuade me from anything. No empty reassurances about discovering purpose or seeking professional help. She simply remained until I recalled what hunger felt like, then returned the following day and again after that, until I began believing I might relearn how to exist." Unexpected tears began forming behind Elaine's eyes, not solely from his anguish, but from recognizing how remarkably similar his experience mirrored her own. How sorrow could transform mere survival into an act of betrayal. How losing someone fundamental could render the remainder of existence meaningless and hollow. "And today I understand that belonging isn't discovered somewhere out there. It's constructed day by day, with individuals who require what you can provide and who give what you need in exchange. Not pity, not treatment, simply the everyday wonder of humans caring for one another." This straightforward observation encompassed everything she'd been attempting to comprehend about her own metamorphosis, about distinguishing between seeking shelter and discovering home. The funds Michael's attorneys might retrieve would offer financial stability, but couldn't buy the sensation of being vital to others' welfare, of having her existence matter in tangible and quantifiable ways. "I believe I must remain here," she declared, the statement emerging with a conviction that caught her off guard. "What about the settlement money? What significance does it hold? I possess everything necessary here, more than necessary, more than I ever had when I believed myself wealthy." Kai extended his hand to take hers, his fingers heated from manipulating stone, surprisingly tender for hands that devoted their days to persuading stubborn materials into becoming art. Around them, the desert was transitioning into evening, and she could detect the far-off sounds of community existence shifting from daytime to nighttime patterns. "There's something additional," she said, discovering bravery in the deepening twilight, "regarding why I needed to remain." "I believe I understand," he responded. When she examined his expression in the starlight, she observed comprehension rather than astonishment, acceptance instead of shock. "The age gap doesn't concern you. The age difference is meaningless. What's important is that we're both individuals who believed we were done with living and found ourselves mistaken. The blaze started before sunrise on a Tuesday in late October, ignited by a downed electrical line that had been compromised by wind and the slow deterioration that claimed all human structures in the desert. By the time the first inhabitants spotted the glow on the horizon, it had already devoured several acres of brush and was advancing toward the community with the relentless appetite of flames seeking fuel in a terrain that had been parched by months of inadequate precipitation. Elaine awakened to voices calling across the gaps between homes, urgent yet controlled, carrying that specific tone people employed when crisis demanded swift action, but panic would only worsen the situation. She stepped outside to find the air dense with smoke and the flavor of distant burning, while the sky eastward glowed orange beneath the pre-dawn stars, like a false sunrise promising devastation rather than renewal. Kai materialized beside her, already dressed and carrying tools she didn't recognize, shovels and what appeared to be specialized wildfire equipment. His expression held the concentrated intensity she'd witnessed when he worked stone, but amplified by understanding that lives rather than art were at stake. "We must evacuate the children from the school," he stated, his voice carrying the composed authority of someone who'd learned to operate under extreme pressure. The fire's advancing faster than anyone anticipated. The following hours passed in a whirlwind of coordinated activity, revealing how profoundly the community understood itself as a unified organism devoted to collective survival. People moved with rehearsed efficiency, suggesting this wasn't their first wildfire encounter. Some evacuated residences, while others labored to create fire breaks around crucial buildings. Children were gathered and counted. Elderly residents were assisted to secure locations, vehicles loaded with essential provisions and positioned for rapid evacuation should the fire prove uncontrollable. Elaine found herself part of a human chain, transferring water buckets from the well to the school, where several younger children had been assembled, while their parents battled the approaching flames. The labor was physically taxing in ways that reminded her how inactive her former existence had been, yet also strangely fulfilling, as if her body was finally being utilized for something genuinely essential rather than merely sustaining itself. The fire generated its own meteorological patterns, creating winds that shifted direction unpredictably and carried embers across fire breaks that had seemed sufficient moments earlier. What had initially appeared to be a controllable emergency gradually revealed itself as something larger and more menacing, requiring decisions about what could be preserved and what would need to be sacrificed to protect what mattered most. They believed the immediate threat had passed. Everything went catastrophically wrong. A wind shift sent the fire racing toward the school faster than anyone had foreseen, and within minutes the wooden structure was encircled by flames rising higher than the roof, blocking the main exit and trapping several children and teachers. Inside the building they'd considered safe. Kai vanished into the smoke before anyone could prevent him, moving toward the burning structure with the kind of resolute focus suggesting muscle memory from situations where hesitation meant death. Elaine watched him disappear into the grey haze and felt something primal seize her. Not love precisely, but recognition of someone whose continued existence had become essential to her understanding of how the world could be organized around care rather than competition. Without conscious decision, she followed him into the smoke and heat, guided more by instinct than sight, toward the sound of children crying and Kai's voice offering reassurance. The smoke inside the school was thick enough to completely disorient, stinging her eyes and filling her lungs with the taste of burning wood and melting plastic. But she could hear voices, young voices raised in fear, but not yet panic, and she moved toward them with the kind of desperate navigation that bypassed rational thought. She located them in the rear classroom, 8 children huddled against the far wall, while Kai struggled to open a window that had been painted shut and now refused to yield to ordinary pressure. The heat was becoming intolerable, and she could hear the fire spreading through other sections of the building, consuming decades of children's artwork and educational materials with the democratic appetite of flame that recognized no distinction between precious and ordinary. Together they lifted children through the window and passed them to waiting hands outside, working with mechanical precision that made each rescue feel simultaneously urgent and routine. The children trusted them completely, offering no resistance to being lifted, and passed through openings that seemed too small for human bodies, understanding somehow that survival required cooperation rather than individual effort. The smoke intensified, the heat grew more severe, but they worked without speaking until the final child was safe. Only then did they permit themselves to follow, tumbling through the window into air that tasted like salvation, and collapsing onto ground that felt solid and dependable after the chaos of the burning building. They lay on the earth outside the destroyed school, coughing smoke from their lungs and watching the roof collapse in a shower of sparks that rose toward the morning sky like visible prayers. Around them, the community was already beginning recovery work, checking for injuries, accounting for losses, planning for the reconstruction that would commence as soon as the ashes cooled. "Is everyone accounted for?" Elaine asked when she could speak again. "Everyone's safe," Kai confirmed, his voice rough from smoke inhalation but carrying unmistakable satisfaction. "The building's lost, but all the children are accounted for." She turned to observe him, noting how soot had darkened his skin and singed his eyebrows, how his clothes bore evidence of close contact with fire and destruction. But his eyes held something she'd never seen before, not just relief at surviving, but the particular joy that comes from being useful in the most essential way possible. "How did you know what to do?" "Training from a previous life, but also instinct. The understanding that sometimes you must run toward danger rather than away from it if you want to protect what matters." This simple statement seemed to contain everything she needed to understand about her choice to follow him into the burning building, about the larger choice she'd been making daily since her car broke down on this stretch of desert highway. Sometimes survival required running toward rather than away from the things that frightened you most. Sometimes the only way to save what mattered was to risk everything you thought you needed. As the sun rose over the smoldering school remains, Elaine felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since Richard's death. Not peace exactly, but recognition that she'd finally learned to live in the present tense, to make decisions based on immediate necessity rather than long-term planning, to trust her instincts rather than her fears. The fire had claimed the building, but it had also burned away the last of her uncertainty about where she belonged and who she was meant to be in this new life she was constructing from the ashes of her old one. 1 year later, Elaine stood in the garden behind the new school, observing Kai demonstrate stone carving techniques to a group of teenagers who approached the work with the gravity of people learning a sacred craft rather than a casual hobby. The building surrounding them was larger than its predecessor, constructed with fire-resistant materials and designed to serve not just as a school, but as a community center that could shelter the entire population during emergencies. Its architecture, reflecting lessons learned from loss. The book felt substantial in her hands, its cover displaying a photograph of desert sunrise and the title she'd chosen after months of revision. The Geography of Belonging, A Teacher's Journey Home. The advance copies had arrived that morning, shipped to an address that now felt more like home than any place she'd ever lived, and she'd carried one outside to read the dedication aloud to the empty garden. "For the children who taught me that, home is not a place we discover, but a place we create together, and for the communities who choose to include strangers in their work of survival." Her publisher had wanted to market it as a memoir of reinvention, a story of a woman discovering new purpose after loss that would appeal to readers facing their own life transitions. But as Elaine had worked on the manuscript through the winter months, writing in the early morning hours before school began and the late evening hours after community responsibilities were complete, she'd realized it was something more complex than simple reinvention. The book had become an exploration of how healing required both solitude and community, both the courage to leave what was familiar and the wisdom to recognize when you'd found something worth staying for. It examined the difference between running away from difficulty and running toward possibility, between seeking refuge in someone else's culture and finding ways to contribute meaningfully to communities that had survived without outside assistance for centuries. The money from Michael's legal efforts had eventually materialized, though less than originally hoped and after legal fees that consumed much of what was recovered. She'd used part of it to establish a fund for the school's library and reading program, part to secure a small piece of land where she was building a house designed to last through desert storms and seasonal extremes, and part to create a scholarship program for students who wanted to pursue higher education while maintaining connection to their home community. The rest remained in accounts that earned modest interest and asked nothing of her except patience. Financial security, she'd learned, was less about accumulating wealth than about needing less, about finding richness in relationships and purpose rather than possessions and status. She lived more simply now than she ever had, but felt wealthier than she could have imagined during her years of suburban comfort. Kai approached with dust on his hands and satisfaction in his expression, his students having completed their first projects, small sculptures that captured something essential about movement or growth, or the patient work of transformation. His teaching style reflected the same principles he brought to his own work: careful attention to the material's properties, respect for the student's natural abilities, and the understanding that the best results came from collaboration rather than domination. "How does it feel to see your words in print?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench they'd built from local stone during the summer months when the new building was taking shape. "Like watching children learn to read," she said, opening the book to a page chosen at random and finding herself looking at her own words about the fire, about the moment when she'd realized that love sometimes required running toward danger rather than away from it. Familiar and miraculous at the same time, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the teenagers clean their tools with the careful attention Kai had taught them to bring to all aspects of their craft. The late afternoon light slanted through the new trees they'd planted, species chosen for their ability to thrive in desert conditions while providing shade and beauty for future generations. In the distance, she could see the garden where students were harvesting vegetables they'd grown using traditional techniques modified with contemporary knowledge about soil conservation and water efficiency. "Do you ever regret not going back?" he asked. Elaine considered the question seriously, as she'd learned to consider all questions that touched on the architecture of choice and consequence. "I regret the pain I caused my brother by choosing myself over family obligation, but I don't regret the choice itself. And the age difference, people still talk. People talked when I was married to someone exactly my age. People talked when I was alone. People talk when you're together. The talking doesn't change based on our choices, so we might as well make choices that make us happy." A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed ground with the effortless navigation that comes from perfect adaptation to environmental conditions. Elaine watched its flight and thought about how love too followed patterns that could only be understood from sufficient distance, that required trust in invisible currents and faith in the possibility of finding sustenance in unlikely places. "I used to think," she said, "that my life was something that happened to me. Circumstances, other people's decisions, accidents, genetics, all the forces I couldn't control. But sitting here now, I think maybe life is what we build from whatever materials we're given. The way you build sculptures from stone, or I build lessons from stories." Kai reached over and took her hand, his fingers still warm from working stone, and somehow always surprising her with their gentleness despite their strength. Around them, the garden hummed with the quiet activity of growth, seeds finding soil, roots extending deeper, leaves turning toward light in the ancient dance of photosynthesis that sustained all life on the planet. "The children want to know if you'll read to them tonight," he said. "What story?" "Whichever one you think they need to hear." Elaine smiled, feeling the familiar anticipation that came with approaching an empty page, a fresh audience, a story, waiting to be discovered in the act of telling. In her previous life, she'd taught literature, as if meaning existed independently of readers, as if her job was to help students find the correct interpretation rather than create their own understanding. But here, in this place where stories were understood to be living things that changed based on who told them and who heard them, she'd learned that the best teaching happened when she trusted her audience to find what they needed in whatever she offered. The evening reading circle had become one of her favorite parts of each day, a time when age differences and cultural boundaries seemed to dissolve in the shared experience of narrative. Children and adults gathered together on blankets, spread across the floor of the new building, and she would read everything from traditional tales passed down through generations to contemporary poetry that spoke to universal experiences of loss and discovery, love and transformation. Tonight she thought she might read from her own book, the section about learning to distinguish between running away and moving toward, about the difference between seeking rescue and offering service, about how home could be created through daily acts of attention and care rather than found in geographic locations or inherited through family connections. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that seemed to exist nowhere else on earth, she stood and gathered her book, ready to begin again the ancient work of helping others find the words that would carry them home to themselves. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of children's laughter, and for the first time in her 63 years of life, Elaine Morrison felt completely present in her own existence, completely grateful for the particular combination of choices and circumstances that had brought her to this place where stories mattered. And community was built through the daily practice of showing up for each other's learning and growth.